things we could all be doing, but we're going to be in for a treat tonight. And I want to thank you. This is Greg Capel. Capel, I'm sorry. I've mispronounced it 2 different ways now. And I'm really appreciative of him coming tonight. And he's going to be talking about the life and leadership of William Upham. And I hope you don't mind, but I got a few things off the internet that I found out about you to introduce you here. And if anything's wrong, please let me know. I don't know, I messed up your name a couple times. So you had a 10-year military career in Michigan Army National Guard and the U.S. Army spanning the years 1980 to 1990, followed by a 30-year career in business as a human resources professional. You also worked as Vice President of Workforce Development and Administration for Rail Transport. That was like 1999 to 2019, maybe? Yes. Okay. And you were an associate lecturer at UW Stevens Point. All right. And that is kind of where I lost your trail. So I'll let you finish that. But one thing I did find that you had a quote that you appreciated about leaders, and you said we can hold opposing points of view and treat each other with respect. True leaders demonstrate respect, and I think probably we can say that about Mr. Upham as well. So
indeed we can,
right.
And we'll feature this evening. So
right.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm glad to be here. As Natalie said, my name is Greg Keppel. I lived here in Marshfield and worked at Rail Transport. I worked at Rail for 20 years, lived here in town for 15 years, and was part of the Upham mansion. I wasn't as active as my wife. I think she did a lot better work than I did, but it was always great fun to be a part of the whole history. I'm not a historian. Certainly I love history, and I like to read history and be involved in learning history, but I'm not a historian. What really drew me in to Governor Upham's story was just the story itself, and what resonated with me. Is that his life was just such a great example of leadership in action, and what a real leader behaves like, and what a real leader acts like. That's important for me because in my role as a human resources professional, I was responsible for teaching people in our company about leadership. People that would be supervisors or managers or directors or vice presidents. And so I was always interested in ways that I could communicate leadership to people. And then now I'm a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and been doing that for 5 years. I teach at the Century School of Business, and the class I've been teaching for the last 5 years is leadership. And so I always end the semester talking about Governor Upham, because it really brings together everything that we learn over the course of the semester. And so I just talked about Governor Upham yesterday in my class. And I gotta tell you, it's always really well received. It really resonates with people. I think you'll find it'll resonate with you. And I think you'll enjoy learning that it resonates with 20-year-olds as well, because it's such a powerful story. Now, I assume most of you, I recognize many faces, and I assume most of you know the basic story of Governor Upham. And if not, we'll just kind of walk through it tonight. And it's certainly we covered some history, because it's historical, because it happened, years ago. But the main point of what I talk about is just simply to point out what he did that represents, again, what I think is true leadership. I call this the signs of leadership because so often we're searching for what direction to go in terms of leadership, and it can be confusing, this way or that way. It's not always clear, and that's because sometimes we look for leadership in the wrong places. A lot of times our leadership examples comes through pop culture, popular culture, and popular mass media. And a lot of things are forced into our aperture and focused for us. And it's like, that's always a distorted view. That's always a distorted view. Is the sign of leadership a title? I think Mr. Mayor would say, no, just because you were the mayor didn't make you a leader, right? You had to work at other things, right? It's not simply in the form of a title. Is it celebrity that makes you a leader? Is it money? Is being a billionaire make you a leader? All these kind of things we often, look to people who are in the white hot spotlight, but a lot of times they really come up short when it comes up to true leadership. So what are the signs of leadership? That's what I was looking for. Which way do we turn? Do we turn this way, we turn that way? I'm not really sure sometimes. You can read a book and it says, oh, leadership is this. You read another book, you say leadership is that. And so I like to step back and I like to say, well, what are some things that people did that really, in my mind, showed effectiveness? The other thing is that we get the passage of time, and actually, rather than time clouding things up and muddying the waters, it can make things more clear. Because the perspective of time, we can look back, we can reflect, we can study, we can say what really happened, and we can get away from just the noise of the moment, and we can look back at what the result was. So actually looking back in time can provide us some of our best right now examples. And that's what I found with Governor Upham's life. We love Marshfield, right? We love our downtown, which is just such a gorgeous, pretty downtown. This tremendous stock of the old buildings on each side, the big, broad, central, and even the wide side streets. It's just such a unique, impressive downtown. Everybody that comes to Marshfield, and you know this, visitors that come to Marshfield, they always comment on our downtown area, just how beautiful it is, how different it is, and how unique it is. And there's so much to be proud of. It's just a magnificent space. And I'm sorry. It's just
I think another element, I didn't mean to interrupt, is the brick. I like the way they left the brick on the main streets in areas.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's very inviting. You've got a color contrast. It's classy.
It without a doubt. I think the redevelopment of downtown, the Central Avenue, just came out magnificent, and it's just a beautiful stretch of downtown, and I think it competes with anywhere. You might remember years ago this store, downtown Book World, and I was walking downtown one day, and I'd often stop in at Book World, see what's going on. And always in the window, they always had some kind of poster of going on around town, this thing or that thing. And that's when I first encountered Governor Upham. There was a poster in the window at Book World, and it said, shake the hand of the man who shook the hand of the man who shook Abe Lincoln's hand. And I thought, what? I'm trying to do the math on this, right? This is not in the 1920s when I was walking downtown, right? This is in the the early 2000s when I'm walking downtown, and I shake the hand of the man who shook the hand of the man who shook Abe Lincoln's hand. And again, I'm doing the math and I'm thinking, well, that would be like just 2 degrees of separation between me and Abe Lincoln, our 16th and many think our greatest president. I thought that was pretty neat, so I was intrigued, and on the poster it said, "Come and learn the story of Bill Upham." Now at that time I didn't know anything about Governor Upham, and I was thinking in my head, Upham. Why do I even know that name? Why do I even know that name? And then all of a sudden it came to me. There's an Upham Street in town. And I thought, oh, okay, yeah, I've been up and down that street, across that street, many, many times. And so, yeah, he must have done something because he got his name up on the street. And so I thought, I'm interested in that. And so I'd like to learn about that. But I was mostly intrigued with this idea of shake the hand of the man who shook the hand of, Abe Lincoln. My goodness, I'm always in on anything to do with Lincoln. I just think he's such an intriguing figure and such a great example of leadership. And like I said, I knew of Upham Street, but I didn't know anything about Upham. So I went to the talk. And learned about William Upham. He grew up in Racine, and he was the youngest of 8 children. And here you can see him up in the corner. And as a gift for William Upham's 20th birthday, right? He was born in 1841. His 20th birthday in May of 1861. As a gift, he received this, just like everybody else around the nation. War, right? The start of the Civil War. The start of the Civil War. The southern states are seceding from the Union. And these are the headlines all across the country. The bombardment of Fort Sumter, the fort on fire. That's what greeted William Upham for his 20th birthday. And when I talk to my students, I always ask them to kind of project themselves into the time that we're talking about, whatever that is, right? One of the key things about leadership is having a certain degree of empathy. So having empathy, and what can fuel your empathy is your imagination. If you project yourself back into these times, and you can imagine what it was like for people when they read these headlines or saw those headlines. And maybe to help you understand the kind of feelings that were going on in people's minds, maybe think about something more contemporary. How did it make you feel when that happened, right? How did you feel when you saw those images, right? It got something going inside of you and maybe even destroyed a part of you. Well, that's how people felt at the beginning of the Civil War, right? Somebody's attacking our nation. Somebody's tearing our nation apart, right? That's what greeted Bill Upham on his 20th birthday. I think at that time he was called Willie. He hadn't gotten the name Bill quite yet. I'm not sure that was common back quite at that time. Maybe not, but he was known as Willie. So that's the kind of thing that, people saw this kind of thing, and it's like, who is attacking us? What's going on? Why is this happening? And around the country, certainly all through Wisconsin, posters like this went out. In the north and the south, right? Volunteers, able-bodied men wanted. Join us, right? We've got to save the Union. Come and join. And so, what did Bill Upham do? Right? Was a 20-year-old. When he saw those posters, he raised his hand and said, yeah, count me in. sign me up. I'm going to be a part of that. And that informs what I call the first sign of leadership. First sign of leadership that he evidences for us. And I call it, I'll do it. I'll do it. That's what leaders do. Leaders raise their hand and they say, I'll do it. Especially the tough stuff. Especially the tough stuff. Right? That's what leaders do. And that's what Bill Upham did. As a 20-year-old, he raised his hand and said, I'll do it. And so he signed up. First, he was a part of the militia from Racine. It was called the Bell City Rifles. Eventually, though, that got folded into the regular army, right? And he got folded into a brigade from Wisconsin. They all gathered at the beginning of the Civil War for training at Camp Randall in Madison. Of course, that's how we know Camp Randall today, right? And it gets its name because it sits on the site of what was the Civil War training ground for the troops in Wisconsin, Camp Randall. And that was named for an early territorial governor of Wisconsin. So they all shipped off to Camp Randall, and they began doing some basic military drilling, marching around, understanding some orders and commands and how you move around as a unit, and beginning to understand some weapons and so on. Just basic military stuff. Not really extensive, because it wasn't long after they arrived that they were already moving out and headed to Washington, D.C. Here you can see a picture of D.C. at the time in the summer of 1861. Wasn't the metropolis we know today, right? It's still developing as our capital. But troops from around the north gathered in D.C. because they figured this is the place that, this is where it's going to happen. Just west of D.C., in an area of Virginia named for a creek called Bull's Run Creek, is where Union troops and Confederate troops were starting to coalesce around. And this would be the place where the first major land battle of the Civil War would take place, at Bull Run. And so they met in July, late July of 1861, right? So it wasn't very long after Upham joined the army, and all of a sudden they're in battle and they're fighting. Now imagine this, it's hot, hotter than hell. I don't know if you've ever been in Virginia in late July. Most summers, it's hot, and humid. And they're wearing their big army uniforms and so on, and they meet the Confederate troops, and a major battle ensued. They fought and fought all day long. It was a brutal affair. Here you can see some of the after effects, right? Farmhouse blown away. All the leaves, this is in the middle of summer, right? There's no leaves on the tree, right? That's from all the bullets and from all the artillery that just stripped the trees bare. It's just devastating, right? Imagine if there was so much of this going on, it did something like this. You could just see the trees the trunk is almost whittled down to nothing. There's that many bullets and cannon fire going on. What do you think it did to the people?
Fear.
It was devastating. And there were tremendous casualties on both sides. Both sides were unprepared for this, right? They thought they would, both sides thought they were going to lick each other, right? And that was going to be the end of it. We'll fight, we'll have a winner, and it'll be over, and the whole thing will be settled. Both sides were way overconfident, right? And the true cost of war came home to roost on that particular day. One person, Bill Upham, right, as he's moving up a hill with his mates, all of a sudden, tremendous fire all around, right? And people are being injured, wounded, or killed all around him. And suddenly Bill Upham is struck by a bullet. I shouldn't say bullet, right? These weren't rifles, these were muskets, right? They were shooting mini balls, and that went through, right, his neck, right where the neck and shoulder come together. And it went through his neck, and it came out his back, and it blew a hole out his back, 4 inches across, right? And down he went, and down he went. His captain, right, commander of his unit, saw him fall and presumed him to be dead instantly when he hit the ground. He said, I saw the countenance change on his face. They were moving on. They were in the middle of the fight, and on they went. A couple of mates stayed with him and tended to him as best they could for as long as they could. Now, this is the beginning of the Civil War. There's no first aid. People don't know anything about that kind of thing, first aid. That'll come later, right? And so what do? One of his mates just did what came like naturally. He began to suck some of the blood out from on his neck where that initial wound was, to kind of get it to flow and then to coagulate and hopefully stop. And at the same time, they just stuffed some rags into his wounds to staunch the bleeding. That's the best they could do, right? Which isn't much. He uttered a few words and said something about his mom. Yeah, bless him, right? And thinking of mom. And then, they took him to a collection point where the wounded were being taken, and they left him there. And they thought that was pretty much it for him. By all accounts, everybody back in his unit thought that Bill was dead, right? And his commander even wrote a letter to the family saying so. And so back in Racine, they held funeral services for Bill Upham and 4 other young men from Racine, 3 other, I should say, young men from Racine that also perished in that first battle of the Civil War. Now, Racine and Racine County is a pretty big area, right? There's a lot going on. Racine's a good-sized city. This is back in 1861. Racine is not a big city then. Small town, maybe 5,000, smaller than Marshfield, right? So people know each other. Now, again, use that imagination and that empathy and think about what kind of devastation it must have been like in that small town when those 4 young men perished and they got word of that. Think about what it's like when just anybody in a community is lost in war. How devastating it is for that town, whether it's Antigo, right? Or down in Wisconsin Rapids. Just think back the last 20 years with America at war so much, when somebody got killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, just how difficult, or here in Marshfield, how difficult that was for the community. And then think about 4 of Racine's young men killed on the same day. Or if a police officer gets killed, or if there's some kind of shooting in the community, people come together and coalesce around that. It affects the whole town. And that certainly was the case in Racine when they got news of what happened, right? And so they mourned those losses, right? They mourned those losses and went on. And the Civil War went on and began in earnest. Sometime later, though, what word came out eventually and came back to the scene and back to the family that there was somebody who was at Libby Prison, an old tobacco warehouse that hastily got converted to a prison in Richmond, Virginia, was captured by the Confederates by the name of Bill Upham. So what happened to Bill Upham was he survived. The doctor, right, that was a part of the Wisconsin Brigade, you know, he was at that collection point and he allowed himself to get captured along with all the wounded. And he was in Libby prison with all the wounded and he tended to all of them as best he could. And amazingly, as critically as he was wounded, he survived. He survived that, right? And so he was alive. And so word came back to his family, word came back to Racine, word came back that Bill Upham was at Libby prison and had survived. Now, this informs the second sign of leadership. Now, I don't know exactly what was in his head, right? He certainly is taught, and when I say he, Governor Upham, had talked about that time, and it was a tough time for him. But he endured it, and he survived. I don't know. He never said exactly what he was thinking when he was laying on the battlefield, dying, right? But I do know a lot of research says, and medical professionals will tell you, that the will to live make all the difference for overcoming traumatic injury or a critical illness like cancer, right? The will to live can make all the difference. And I believe the will to live was very strong with Bill Upham. And that informs sign 2. Get up. Get up. Life is going to knock the crap out of you. It always does. There's always something that's going to knock you down or knock you back or put you on your keister. Leaders, get up. Brush themselves off and continue on. And that's what Bill Upham did. Get up. As part of the first prisoner exchange of the Civil War, Bill Upham was one of the people that was going to be repatriated to the North. Right? So he was going to leave Libby prison. He did leave Libby prison and got repatriated back to the North. Along the way, so they came north on a barge. They sailed from Richmond back up to central Virginia. And on the way, they passed this ship, and he talks about this. He talked about this. This is the USS Cumberland. And you can see on the back of the Cumberland is the U.S. flag. It was flying in the back of the Cumberland. When he saw that, he was so struck, right? He said, I'm back home. I'm back to my country. That flag so inspired him. He talked about literally being lifted off the deck and felt like he was walking on air. That all that bad stuff of being in prison was behind him, and he's going home. He's going back to his nation, back to his country, back to freedom. He was so inspired by seeing the flag. And so back to Washington he went. And when he got to Washington, he was met by Senator Doolittle. Senator Doolittle was Wisconsin senator who was from Racine, whose son was in the same unit as an officer in the same unit as Bill Upham. So Senator Doolittle knew Bill Upham and vice versa. And at this time, think about it, right? Here's a guy who was shot and killed and died on the battlefield in the first battle of Bull Run. And all of a sudden, wait, what? No, he's not. right? He's risen, right? And he's alive. And so that story really captured a lot of people's imagination right at the time, right? And so a little bit of notoriety begins to follow Bill Upham, right? So Senator Doolittle says, let's go to the White House and we're going to meet the president. And so that's what they do. They go to the White House and they meet President Lincoln. And so Upham is meeting with President Lincoln. They're in a room. There's all kinds of people in there. There's generals and other high-ranking officers. There's politicians and Senator Doolittle and other politicians, the president and the president's aides and other people. And President Lincoln meets Upham, and he's personally interested in his story. He asked Upham to take off his jacket and take off his shirt so he could actually see the wound, right? And so he puts his hand, a very familiar, easygoing way as you can imagine with Lincoln, and he puts his hands to feel his wound in the back. Then he shares with Upham the way his grandfather died in kind of a similar wound. He was shot and the bullet or the round went right through him. And so he shared that with Upham. And like I said, he was very taken with Upham. A little later on during the meeting, a telegraph comes in from the War Department. And it's announcing the death of a Confederate general that was just killed in battle. And so Lincoln passes that around to all the generals and officers and politicians in the room. And everybody reads it to understand what was going on. And then Lincoln turns to Upham and he hands the telegram to Upham to read. And right there and then, Upham recognized, and what he commented on and said many times later on in his life, what Lincoln was doing, right? Me, a lonely private soldier, in amongst all these people, Lincoln handed that to me to read. And in doing so, he was showing me the same respect, the same consideration for me as any general officer, knowing that me, a private, I was giving my all for the country just as much as any general or anybody else. That was a profound impact on Upham, which he mentioned for the rest of his life. Now, I imagine he had a tremendous upbringing and probably learned the value of respect, in his family. But it wasn't lost on him what Lincoln was doing. When Lincoln handed him that telegram, he said, that was a sign of respect for me. And it made a profound impact on him. So much so was Lincoln taken with Upham and his story and the way Upham carried himself, that Lincoln had 2 at-large appointments that he could make to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Usually, most of the appointments were made by senators back in the States, but they reserved a couple for the president. Lincoln was so impressed with Upham that he made Upham one of his appointments to West Point. And in so doing, Upham was the first enlisted person in the history of the country to be appointed to West Point. Upham, when he went into the office to meet the president, thought he was on his way home. I'm done with war. I had enough. Next thing you know, he goes out of the office and he's on his way to West Point. But he recognized the tremendous opportunity that was in front of him now. And so that meeting with Lincoln informs sign 3. Respect. Respect. Leaders respect others. And that seems to be one of the most difficult signs for people to grab hold of, right? somebody might have a differing point of view, and people want to personalize that. Lincoln didn't do that, and Bill Upham didn't do that as well. Yeah, we can have differences of opinions, we can have different ideas, we can have different beliefs, but I can recognize you, I can see you as a person, and I can value you for your basic humanity, respect for others. So Upham went to West Point, and he graduated. Just before graduation, Lincoln visited West Point, and so Upham got to meet Lincoln again, just before he graduated. And he recalled of the meeting that they had just gone through their exams, and he didn't really know how well he did, and so he's meeting with Lincoln, and he mentioned, well, I just finished my exams, and I haven't got the result yet. Lincoln turns to the superintendent of the academy and says, well, how do you do? And the superintendent said, he passed. A whole day before everybody else, he knew the result, that he had passed his final exams, and once again had a chance to be with Lincoln and meet with Lincoln. This is the end of the Civil War, right? He was at West Point through the rest of the Civil War, and the Civil War now has come to a close. Another birthday present, because now it's the spring, and Upham's birthday is in May, and his first duty assignment, right? The war is over now, and he's headed to Florida to be join an artillery unit. But on his way, they change his orders around, and what ends up being his first duty assignment, he becomes the head of the guard detail for this man, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America. So in a strange twist of fate, now Upham is one of the few people that actually knew and had a relationship with both the protagonist and antagonist presidents during the Civil War. Now think about this. Bill Upham's a young guy, and he's a rambunctious kind of guy. He's got a great sense of humor, and he's always known for pushing the envelope a little bit, always testing the boundaries a little bit. So he's not afraid. And now he's the head of the guard detail, one of the president of the Confederate States of America. If you think about it, this is the guy responsible for him having a mini ball go through his neck, come out his back. He's responsible for him spending months in a prisoner of war camp without enough to eat, with not out real medical attention, right? In the tremendous heat of the South, old tobacco warehouse, right? This guy's responsible for a lot of misery of a lot of people, both Upham directly and a lot of people Upham knows, and his whole country, right? Divided his whole country. So what do you think, as head of the guard detail, this affords Upham the opportunity to do? Right? When the bad guy now, right, you get to decide, okay, the bad guy, how am I going to treat the bad guy? How am I going to treat the bad guy? Well, it was, as you would imagine, somebody who learned lessons from President Lincoln. Yes, obviously tremendous differences between Jefferson Davis and Bill Upham, right? But Upham did what he knew to do, to have respect for others. He stayed away from the conversation of politics, right? And the groups, causes of war and that type of thing. But they talked for hours on end. Upham said often past midnight. They would stay up and talk because Davis knew Wisconsin actually pretty well. Davis was also a West Point grad, an Army officer, and early in his career, he spent time in Wisconsin, especially during the Black Hawk Wars, right? Which were mostly localized skirmishes with the Black Hawk tribes of southeastern and southern Wisconsin. So Davis had been in Wisconsin, so they shared that familiarity, and they would talk and converse, but never did they get on the subject of politics. And what Upham did is show respect. Didn't agree with him politically, didn't even have to like him personally, but he did treat him with respect. Would any of us be the same when our tormentor is sitting right there? A powerful, powerful lesson in leadership. When he left the Army, right, which was 1869, he married his sweetheart from Racine, Mary Kelly. And here you see Mary teaching some reading to a couple of young kids. She was a big education and literacy advocate. And that's one of the things that she did through her whole life, was to promote education, reading, literacy. And here you see her with a couple of kids doing exactly that. Bill Upham came back to Wisconsin, married Mary, and he worked with his brother who had a sawmill in the Shawano area. And this is now Wisconsin in the 1870s, right? It's all about lumber, right? That's what built Wisconsin. That's what built the Midwest, right? Harvesting all of the timber from Wisconsin, especially the northern 2/3 of the state. That built Chicago, that built St. Louis, that built the Midwest. And so he was a part of that. He was a part of that lumber industry with his brother. His brother was ready to move on from the mill in Shawano, though. They'd been very, very successful. Time to cash out, and so he sold the mill, turned a tidy profit. The mill had been successful the whole time they operated it. Now, what's Bill Upham going to do? His brother's a bit older. He's far too young to stop working, right? So his brother kind of points him in a direction and turns him towards the west and points him in the direction of Marshfield. And off to Marshfield he heads. Now, I'm not saying Shawano was the cultural capital of Wisconsin at the time, but compared to Marshfield, look, at the time that Bill Upham came over to Marshfield, here's a wing of the Hotel Marshfield back at the time. You can't see over on the other side of the picture. There's more normal kind of clapboard siding and a couple different stories, but that's a part of what was the Hotel Marshfield at the time when he arrives in the late 1870s. Marshfield at that time was really just a hovel. It's just a railroad siding. Unlike a lot of communities where the railroad, comes because the community is there and there's commerce and it's a transportation point often associated with the river, that's not what's going on over here. At that point in our country's history, if people wanted access to that lumber that was up in the northwest, right? First, you had to build a railroad. The government said, you want access up there, you build a railroad, and then you can have access. So from Marshfield, they were building a railroad up to the northwest, right? So Marshfield became a place where crews would launch out and go work on the railroad and come back and supplies and this and that. So not really much going on in Marshfield at the time. Could you imagine what his wife Mary was thinking? We're going where? What? What are you thinking? But such was Bill Upham, that he could see things maybe that other people couldn't see. Where most people would just see a railroad siding. He saw a city. He had a sense for what the possibilities were and what the potential was. He knew the lumber business. He was going to start a lumber company. He was also going to start a furniture company. He knew that once all the trees are gone, what's left? A lot of good land for agriculture and planting. And he was going to start a mill that could process those agricultural crops, right? And so he could see that. And that illustrates sign 4 of leadership. Vision. Vision. Mary, who knows what she was thinking? I can imagine she's thinking, I've always believed in this guy. He's pretty solid, so I'm going to go along. But my goodness, the first year that they were in Marshfield, there were 7 murders by gunshot. Now, probably the next 100 years of the city's history, there weren't that many murders in total. But it was still the Wild West when he landed in Marshfield. It took a lot, but he had that vision. And that's what leaders have. Where other people just see a railroad siding, leaders see a city. And that's what Bill Upham saw. And boy, did he see it. He built a thriving lumber mill, built a thriving furniture business, and people came. And people came and came because he had something going. And we've got something we can do. We've got a place where we can have jobs, we can have work, we can make a living. And so the people came and they were a part of that economic engine that was his businesses. And the town began to thrive. And here you see a picture of Main Street, Marshfield. This is a different orientation. And some of you probably know this history better than me. This is a different orientation than the current downtown area has, which kind of runs north and south. This orientation was more east and west. And here you see, typical of the times, right? In the 1780s, wooden buildings, nice buildings. You've got nice big signs, things going on. But wooden structures, always a little bit scary. And he's in the lumber business, so he's always kind of concerned with things like fire, right? One of the things he does is he builds a water system. He builds a water tower, and he offers the service of this water system to the city at cost. At cost. Not to turn a profit, but he understands this is a way that we can potentially protect ourselves. And in doing so, that tells us about sign 5, right? Which is for the greater good. Upham was always about doing things for the community, doing things in the service of others. Yes, he was a business person and a business operator, and he knew about the importance of running an effective business and making a profit, certainly. But he didn't have blinders on to the rest of the world. He was also simultaneously about helping others and helping the community that was so important to him. And so that informs sign 5, for the greater good. Unfortunately, that fire did come to Marshfield. That fire did come to Marshfield. And just think about it. We're going through it right now, right? You turn on the Weather Channel tonight, you're going to hear about tornadoes going through the heartland of the country and destroying communities and upending people's lives, right? And so we see this, right? We'll see this on the news tonight, right? From Oklahoma through Ohio, from Kentucky and Illinois and Indiana. That's what's going on right now tonight. And so that's what happened in Marshfield. Fire came and it just destroyed the community. 250 structures wiped out. That's pretty much all of Marshfield at the time. 300 families left homeless. That's most of Marshfield at the time. So you can imagine that devastation. We see it and we're familiar with it and we know what it does to a community. That's what happened to Marshfield. That's what happened to Marshfield. What does Upham do? That guy who raises his hand and says, I'll do it, who knows that he knows what it's like personally to get kicked in the butt and have to get up and recover from that. He knows what it's like to not be respected or have a lack of respect. He knows what it is to respect others. He's got a sense in his mind of what the possibilities are. And where other people see nothing but damage and destruction, he says, I think we can rebuild. And I think we can do it better than we did before because he's got that vision. He's inspired by his community and serving his community for the greater good. So he gathers people around him, right? He knows what he has to do. He says, come on over to my place, right? And we know the Upham Mansion, right? The Upham History House, which is such a wonderful jewel and just a wonderful part of our community that it's still here today. And so he invites people to come to his home right after the fire, right? And he's recalling that time when he saw the Cumberland and the flag on the back of the Cumberland and what it did for him and how it lifted his spirits, right? How meaningful that symbol was for him, how he understood that we can rise from the ashes. And so he says, come on out to my house. And he's on the porch of his house. And he tells everybody, when that flag hits the top of the flagpole, that's our signal to rebuild. Come on, be a part of this with me. Don't give up on Marshfield. Let's do this. And that informs sign 6. Leaders understand the power of symbols and the way symbols can be inspiring. And Upham certainly understood that. He knew the power of the flag as a symbol for him personally, and he was going to use that. When that flag hits the top of the flagpole, that's our signal to rebuild. Let's go, Marshfield. And so they did. They did. And Upham led the charge. Upham led the effort. You know, he's a successful business person, right? He was also the highest ranking or a very high ranking officer in the Grand Army of the Republic, basically the American Legion of the day, right? Military veterans of the Civil War. So he was a leader in that effort, in that group in Wisconsin. So he is well known in the veteran community. He's well known in the business and commercial community. He was selling products all the way to England, right, from his mill. He sold his furniture all around the Midwest, in all the big department stores and the big houses, right, in the Midwest. So he's well known. So he puts the call out. Marshfield is in need, right? We've been wiped out. We're suffering. Help us. Help us. Come on. Rally around our cause. Rally around the flag of Marshfield. He puts the call out. And one day, he gets a check in the mail. He opens it up. Opens up the envelope, and there's a check there. A check for $25,000. Now, you can go home tonight and you can do the Google calculation and figure out, boy, what is $25,000 from 1887 worth today? It's a lot. It's a lot, right? It's a check for $25,000. There's no promissory note. There's no legal loan document with it that he has to sign. There's nothing like that. It's just a check for $25,000. On the back it says, Upham, good luck on your rebuilding. That was the character of Bill Upham. That he inspired faith in him and his efforts that somebody would just write a check for that kind of money and send it off to him with no concerns about whether they'd ever see that money again or not. Because they knew who Bill Upham was and they knew his character. So that was this guy, a business person from Chicago by the name of Marshall Field. Marshall Field was a department store magnate, right, from Chicago. An extremely big and successful chain of department stores. In recent years folded into the Macy's. But the physical stores still exist, and many of the Marshall Field's type of products still exist in those stores. But Upham did business with Marshall Field, sold his furniture in those stores, right? So Marshall Field knew Bill Upham, and he was confident in him, and he wrote him that check. That was the first of many checks that would pour into Marshfield, right, as they got support in their rebuilding. And that informs sign 7, enlist. Leaders enlist other people in their cause and in their efforts, right? They don't go it alone. They're very careful to nurture and bring other people through those relationships they have with people into their vision, into their cause, and to mobilize them. And that's what he did. Marshall Field enlisted because of Bill Upham. And so the money came in, and the city began to transform. And you commented, right, Shelby, on the brick. One of the things that happened as the city rebuilt was it rebuilt as a brick and mortar city, right? Gone were the wood storefronts, gone were the wooden buildings, right? Maybe residences, but all the commercial buildings now were brick and mortar. And it happened quickly. Within a year, there were 65 new structures of brick and mortar construction in Marshfield. It was an amazing thing. You think about how long it takes to build some things these days and how costly it can be. This Marshfield rose from the ashes, and within a year's time, that's what we have, right? And Bill Upham led that effort. People from around the Midwest, from around the country, were celebrating Marshfield, coming to see let's look at this. Look how they're building this town. This was a model city after it was done. And we see that today on Central Avenue, right? That's the legacy of that effort when Marshfield rose from the ashes. Those buildings exist today, right? From that time period to now, because the citizens of Marshfield followed his heed when that flag hit the top of the flagpole. They said, yeah, we're in. We're going to rebuild. That result lives with us today. The big, wide Central Avenue. Why? So fire won't jump from one side to the other. The wide side streets, the same thing. The brick and mortar construction, right? And it stood the test of time. In fact, there have been fires in and amongst these buildings, right? Yet it didn't take down the whole town, right? So it stood the test of time. So now his notoriety really grows. His notoriety really grows, both in the Grand Army of the Republic and because of the rebuilding of Marshfield. And so now he is called upon and decides he's going to run for governor. He does, and is elected governor in an overwhelming majority, right? He only serves one term, right? And at that time, it's a 2-year term. One of the things, though, that he signs into law as governor is the first Civil Rights Act in the history of the state. The first Civil Rights Act in the history of the state. respect for others. So he leaves politics. Eventually he leaves business. He and his wife marry, not feeling so good. And the advice of their physicians, start to travel a little bit. So you get away from here, get away from the hubbub, get away from the business, and go see the world. So they do. Here you can see them in Egypt. The governor, and this is in like the early 1900s, circa 1910. Governor up on the camel, and Mary's relegated to the donkey. And so, they get a chance to get out and get over to Europe and see some of the world. But Mary never really recovers, and she dies soon after. So his wife of 40 years precedes him in death. The governor and his wife never had any children of their own, but they adopted 2 daughters. And those 2 daughters went on to raise families of their own. And here you can see Governor Upham with the kids. And so he's enjoying retired life, but he's still active, keeping up with politics. And here you can see the New York Times. And this is Thursday, March 3rd, 1921. And Washington livens up on the eve of Harding's coming. They're celebrating the election of President Harding. And in this article in the New York Times, you get this little blurb. One of the most jubilant Republicans yet to arrive in Washington is William Upham of Marshfield, Wisconsin, ex-governor of that state and uncle of Fred Upham, treasurer of the Republican National Committee. Mr. Upham, who is 81 years old and looks not more than 2/3 of that age, is a stalwart Westerner and the father of a child 5 years old. Wait, what? The father of a child 5 years old. Yeah. There you see Bill with the kids. And that picture that I showed you previously was also his son's, right? And so that was with his second wife, right? His second wife. And here you see them near their home in Palm Beach, Florida, where they would spend time, and then back in Marshfield during the more pleasant weather up here. And yes, 2 kids. 2 kids. And so that leads me to this. What's the most famous question in English literature?
To be or not to be.
Exactly. To be or not to be, right? From Shakespeare's play. Hamlet, right, I think. I'll let the librarian figure that out.
Hamlet.
Yeah. To be or not to be, right? I wrote a response to Mr. Shakespeare. I call it, finally the answer. B. The answer is B, right? That's Mr. Upham, right? The sign of leadership number 8, B. B, engage life. Live life to the fullest. That's what Bill Upham did. That's why at 76 years old, yes, he's married again, right? He could have just moped about, or he could have just said, hey, I'm on my own now, whatever. Instead, no, he wasn't going to stop living. He wasn't going to stop living, right? So he remarried, and he thought so much about what was ahead for him and all the good things that he was willing to start a family, right? And he had those 2 young boys. B. Live life to the fullest. Engage life. Be a part of life. Be. So that leads me to this article by former Governor V. Sherman Dreyfus. Lee Dreyfus was governor of Wisconsin. Before he was governor of Wisconsin, he was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, right, where I work and teach. And in a local paper, the governor wrote, Governor Upham led a charmed life. And I get it. I get it. You know, a lot of things happened to Governor Upham where people would say, oh, what a lucky guy, right? But with all due respect to Governor Dreyfus, I gotta say, no, you got it all wrong. You got it all wrong. Is it a charmed life, right? That on your 20th birthday, you're greeted by war and the ending of your country? Is it a charmed life that finds you with a hole in your neck and out your back, right? Laying on a hot, hot battlefield in the middle of Virginia. Maybe it's lucky to go to a prison camp. Ooh, I won the lottery, I'm going to prison camp. What kind of luck is that? What kind of charm is that? To be in prison camp. Maybe it's lucky to try and not be able to have kids, right? Wife. Maybe, you know, when your wife dies, 40 years, the love of your life. Where's the luck in that? How about when your city and your business is burned to the ground? Ah, that's a charmed life.
Get back up.
You get back up for sure. You get back up. So I understand, you know, the twist that he's trying to put on it, but it's all wrong. He didn't live a charmed life, right? He led the life of a leader. Be. He led a made life. He made these things happen, right? He didn't let those things dictate to him what would be. He dictated what would be. That's the life of a leader, right? And that's not a charmed life. That's a constructed and made life. That's a purposeful life through his energies and efforts.
Plus his vision.
Pardon me?
Plus his vision.
Absolutely. All of it, right? I'll do it. Get up. Respect for others. From Lincoln himself, no less. Vision. Where others see a siding, you see a city. For the greater good, I believe in Marshfield, and I'm for Marshfield. And my energies are going towards Marshfield. The power of symbols. Enlist. Be. Engage life to the fullest. That guy.
What were the last two, my dear?
Oh, and I'll put those back up for you later. But the last one
Oh,
was
enlist and be. Okay.
enlisting be. Here's the guy that was featured on the poster. Shake the hand of the man who shook the hand of the man who shook Abe Lincoln's hand, right? This is the guy who was giving the lecture that I went to that was telling the story. And here I am shaking his hand, right? So there's Bill Upham, there's him, and then there's me, number 3. You know, that connection to Lincoln is very powerful. This guy is this guy.
Oh.
That's Bill Upham Jr. That's Bill Upham Jr. Right. Upham Sr.'s oldest son. 8 years old here. 8 years old here. When I met him, he was in his 80s. won't be too much longer. And
Your attention, please. The library will be closing in 20 minutes. All of today's meeting room reservations are now expiring. If you're using one of our meeting rooms, please gather your things and exit the room. If you have materials you would like to borrow, please check them out now. The library will be closing in 20 minutes. Thank you.
I know somebody. We're good. So Bill Upham Jr., he's the one who is talking about his dad and sharing that story. And so that's when I first started to learn about Bill Upham.
When was that picture taken?
That was in the early 2000s.
I mean, the one of you in this drum.
Yeah, that was in the early 2000s.
Okay.
Is that at the Eagles Club?
No, that was at the mansion.
What?
That was at the mansion. And we had a dinner.
Yeah.
And do you remember what year that was, Tom?
I thought it was late 90s, but I'm not
I
very.
think it was a little bit later than that, but I think it was maybe the early 2000s. But I'm sure we can go back and look and figure out when we had that dinner. Sorry about that. I often play music when I do my presentation. And when I do this presentation, a lot of times with my students, I'll play a song at the beginning. It's called Live Like We're Dying. And I'll play that at the end as well, Live Like We're Dying. Because that's how Bill Upham lived his life. He lived like he was dying every day. Because he did. He did. And so he knew the value of this opportunity, and he wasn't going to waste it. And he did. And in his life, to me, we find an excellent example of leadership behaviors in action.
And you presented it very well.
Okay, thank you.
What do we know about his second wife? Was she a lady of prominence or of the community or?
So, yeah, help me out with me, Grace
Mason.
Mason. And she was from Beaufort, North Carolina. And so after Upham's wife, Mary Kelly passed, a little bit later, he built himself a small yacht, right? I don't even know if it's called a yacht by today's standards, right? But back in that time, it was, and it was constructed over in Fox Valley. And he went down Mississippi through the Gulf Coast, came around the other side, bad weather, stopped in North Carolina, knew people all along the way, and knew people in that area, met Grace Mason. She was considerably younger than him. I think when they returned, right, it was a while before he got back to town. People in Marshfield were like, where's the governor? Where's the governor? And when he got back into town, lo and behold, he's got a wife. And I think he said she was 30 and he was such and such. Wow. A little cheating going on there. She was younger than 30 and he was older than in terms of, but they were trying to maintain some decorum, but she was considerably younger than him. And they had two kids, Bill and
Fritz.
Pardon me? Fritz. And he just passed, his youngest son just passed in 2018. He lived in Fort Collins, Colorado. And he was 97.
Was that Fritz?
Yeah, and I think some people from here had visited Fritz not too long before he passed. And you think about that connection, right? Again with Lincoln, all the way to 2018. And just kind of a neat, interesting little twist. But that's what I know about his wife. After he passed, she married a local banker. And she continued to live in the community. The boys were raised right here in town, and both went on to have successful careers in their own right. His sister, I forget her name. She was also a very notable person, And she settled out west in Denver and became like the first female superintendent of schools for the state of Colorado, and was one of the first females to hold that type of role anywhere in the country. So his family, his brothers were successful in business. His nephew, Fred Upham, as I referred to in the article, he became treasurer of the Republican Party nationally. So they were always involved in politics, and the family did quite well. Yeah. So that's a little bit I know about.
Did people accept his wife with her being so much younger than him? I mean, that's a
Yes.
significant age difference.
There was a significant age difference, but Governor Upham was so beloved. My understanding is they were embraced by the community. Their marriage was.
He wasn't thought of as a dirty old man or
Nope.
something like that.
It was quite the contrary, and the kids were with him all the time, and on his shoulders or wherever, and he, a lot of contemporaneous articles from the papers of the day talk about just how much joy he took from the kids, and I think the community at large celebrated that joy with him. So I hope you enjoyed it. A little bit different take, more leadership maybe than history, but we would all do well to follow the example of Governor Upham, especially in today's state of affairs, right?
Very well done.
My pleasure, and
Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. You're a phenomenal storyteller. And I learned quite a few new things that I felt like I was kind of in an M. Night Shyamalan movie there for a minute. It all's coming together. And if anybody wants to know, I do have that soliloquy from Hamlet memorized. I've never ever been able to use it before, so I'm like, I can finally say this if anyone wants a recitation sometime. So.
well, and now you have to memorize my rejoinder.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, Mr. Upham lived the life well lived, I think so. And thank you for bringing all of those details to light for us. I really appreciate it. Next month, our spoken history will be on a Saturday, June 8th. And we're kind of doing something a little differently, and we're gonna have a speaker, Linda Durant, and her friend John Hallis come, and they're gonna be talking about turn of the century hand crank sewing machines. And they're gonna be bringing several examples. Love to see you all back again in a month. Yeah.
Good to see you. Thank you. Likewise. Yes. Thank you. Have a good evening.
May I shake your
Oh,
hand?
of
If the
course.
hand that
Yes,
shakes.
absolutely.
Have a
pleasure. Yes.
I know, Don.
Yes,
Just a good job.
Minnesota, I just moved out to WSP, and we started working together, so I moved to St. Paul. How about you? What have you been up to?
I retired from about 5 years. I ended up with another local directory.
Oh, okay.
Graphic arts and sales.
She said it doesn't work out. Shelby, good to see you.
Yeah.
That's it. He's done lots for Marshfield.
Oh, no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Thank you. You've always been a good supporter. And otherwise, I'm getting all caught up in history.
Yeah.
I gotta pull myself out of my office and once in a while to do something productive. But we've been working together with fortunately 50 people together. I just finished like the 5th or 6th one that I did. And I told him yesterday when I said, well, I'm sitting
Yeah.
Yeah, and I said, there's nothing else that I can want done this college. I can't do anything right now. I told him this afternoon. We did home events. He said, because their family had a two-line nomination. Our dad should be recognized.
Yeah.
I couldn't really use that as part of something. So before I came here,
The library will be closing in 10 minutes. So please check out any materials that you would like to borrow now. We will be closing in 10 minutes.
I think you're
Thank you.
Yeah.
all hands and boys.
Yeah, I used to know those guys too.
Yeah, so